Great. So starting again, introducing our speaker, whom I'm honored and pleased to have here with us today, NYU Liberal Studies. Rusha is an Egyptian-American researcher and writer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her work focuses on social movements, revolutions, particularly in the Middle East, with an emphasis on themes of leadership, organization, collective action across lines of class, gender, religion, and ideology. And her book, Tahrir Youth, Leaders of a Leaderless Movement, that was published in 2022 from AUC Press, American University in Cairo, draws on ethnographic fieldwork in Cairo during the 2011 uprising to examine activist agency in the absence of formal leadership. Her research has been featured on NPR, Al Jazeera, and Jadaliyya, and actually it was in Tahrir Square that I actually got to know Rusha and encounter her as I was also conducting my fieldwork. So we go way back, and it's such a pleasure to have her here present her research and share insights more broadly about social movements. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rusha. And thank you, Rusha, for being with us. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry for that. I can't be the first one. Please don't make that mistake. It happens.
It's a funny impression.
So I'm really honored and grateful for this opportunity to be here with you all today, not just to share my research on the Egyptian Revolution, but to think out loud with you about its relevance to this current moment of rupture that we're in today with Gaza, which of course has expanded dramatically in recent weeks, as well as the global movement that's been building up in solidarity with Palestinians in their struggle for liberation. And I think it's important that we think about these two causes together because they are inextricably interlinked with deeply intertwined histories and bound up futures, making them essentially, one and the same. And of course, what ties these struggles together, along with what I would say, the other Arab Spring movements, are the common forces that they're up against, right? So on the one hand, you have the settler colonial state of Israel, the US's imperial outpost in the region, dispossessing and massacring Palestinians. And on the other hand, you have these authoritarian Arab regimes complicit in this oppression, chief among them Washington's clients in Cairo.
I don't think so. If you click the.
I am. It's not working. Yeah. Should I just
Yeah.
Okay. I'll click the screen.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
Thank you, Jay.
So since the signing of the Camp David peace accords in 1979, Egypt has been an indispensable ally in maintaining US interests in the region. It has worked closely with Israel to protect its security, repressing Palestinians alongside them by upholding the blockade of Gaza on its border. And at the same time, the Egyptian state represses its own people, the majority of whom I would say stand in solidarity with their Palestinian neighbors and object to their government's complicity in this injustice against them. And Egyptians, I think, know very well that this solidarity with Palestinians is one of the main reasons why the US props up these autocrats that tyrannize them, right? Obstructing them from achieving genuine democratization in their country. So it's both the anti-Zionism of Egyptians and their desire to upend the imperial order that keeps Egypt subservient to the US and the West that makes Egyptians such a threat, right? Because, if the government in Egypt were responsive to Egyptian public opinion, this would essentially spell the end of the Zionist project, US hegemony, and the Arab powers that profit off of them. It's for this reason why Palestinian intellectuals such as George Habash saw that region-wide revolts were necessary for their liberation. His famous slogan, "The road to Jerusalem passes through Amman, Damascus, and Cairo," speaks to this. And it's a belief that Egyptians have long shared. In fact, we saw echoes of it, of this slogan during the 2011 revolution with signs that read, "The liberation of Jerusalem begins with the liberation of Cairo." And we also saw actions from the revolutionaries that demonstrated their solidarity and their belief in this idea. So, for instance, in 2011, Egyptian protesters stormed the Israeli embassy twice in Cairo, and they expelled the Israeli ambassador. And then in November of 2012, during another Israeli military operation in Gaza, a convoy of Egyptian activists broke the siege through the Rafah border. The convoy was over 550 people strong, making it the largest civilian group to enter the Strip since 1967, and one of the most moving expressions of Egyptian solidarity with Palestinians ever. In their joint press conference with Palestinian activists at Al-Shifa Hospital during this convoy mission, which you see pictured here, Egyptian organizers actually emphasized that the Egyptian revolution would not succeed unless Palestine was free. Okay, so now with that preface and these interconnections between these struggles in mind, I want to shift gears and focus on the question of praxis by taking a closer look at what happened when Egyptian activists tried their hand at liberating Cairo, and by extension, Jerusalem, through revolution in 2011, and what we can learn from their experience for the struggle ahead. So my remaining discussion will be based on my book, Tahrir's Youth, which tells the story of the young people who ignited the Egyptian revolution, and through their story explores the themes of leadership and organization in the movement. So beyond just trying to shed light on the experience of Egypt's revolutionaries, my goal with this book is to ask some bigger questions about the challenges facing mass movements today and the future of revolutionary organizing in the 21st century. So, with the escalating crisis in the region and the new opportunities it's opening up for activists there and beyond, these questions to me feel especially urgent. So the questions that drive this study revolve around tropes that surfaced during the early days of the revolt. As many of you will recall, maybe not many, those of you that are old enough to remember, when those inspiring images of the revolting Egyptian masses were erupting on our Facebook and Twitter feeds back in 2011, there were all kinds of new phenomena we were being told we were witnessing. The media narrative at the time was that this was a spontaneous leaderless uprising powered by social media. For the first time, we heard terms like the Facebook revolution, right? And at the same time, much was said about it being, about this revolution being youth-led. And so these scenes and these descriptions really inspired and fascinated me, not just as a young Egyptian, but as a student of social movements. And I was especially intrigued by this tension that I saw between these descriptions. Like, how could the revolution be both leaderless and youth-led? Which one was it? Could it be both? How? So I decided to travel to Cairo to see what I might learn. And sure enough, what I discovered was that these spontaneous and leaderless tropes were, in fact, inaccurate, and they failed to understand the movement on its own terms. And so I realized a much more useful and theoretically generative approach was to take for granted that there were leaders in the Egyptian revolution, as in any movement, because there's really no such thing as a leaderless movement, right? We can talk about that more. And instead, try to understand their agency in this moment. So the questions the presentation will focus on are, what were the key conditions that enabled the youth's agency as revolutionary leaders? And then what were the constraints on that agency that prevented them from achieving a winning outcome for their movement? These questions, in my mind, help us recover some critical learnings from the protagonists behind this historic movement, including critical lessons that we would miss if we just accepted this leaderless narrative without probing it and asking questions. So to give you some context for my study, I want to quickly go over or just remind you of the key players and a brief timeline of what we call the revolutionary period, which spanned about 4 years total and includes 4 subperiods. The first is the 18-day mass uprising that began on January 25th, 2011, and led to the ouster of Mubarak, who had been in power for 30 years and had consolidated Egypt into an authoritarian neoliberal police state. The epicenter of the uprising was the famous Tahrir Square in Cairo. And the grievances that drove Egyptians to the streets in rebellion were both socioeconomic and political in nature. So they included crushing poverty, political repression, police brutality, rampant corruption, and discontent with the country's foreign policy, especially its US-Israeli relations. The second is the 18-month democratic transition period that was overseen by the military body known as SCAF, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, which took power after removing Mubarak. This also marks the beginning of when the Muslim Brotherhood, which was then Egypt's largest, oldest, and most organized opposition group, they now break away from the multi-ideological revolutionary coalition that ousted Mubarak, and they start to look out for their own interests and play the political game accordingly. The third is Mohamed Morsi's one-year presidency following Egypt's first free democratic election in June of 2012. Morsi is the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood. The fourth period begins with the June 30th, 2013 uprising against Morsi, which is followed by the July 3rd coup that removes him from power 3 days later. Then we have the horrific events of the Rabaa and Nahda Square massacres of Morsi supporters. And this also now marks the start of Sisi's rise to power, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's the president of Egypt today. And this moment sort of signals the defeat of the revolution at the hands of the counter-revolution. And it also marked the beginning of arguably the most repressive period in modern Egyptian history, which unfortunately we're still living through today. And this is just to give you a sense of how my fieldwork and interviews with the activists mapped out onto this timeline. So the group that I ended up profiling for this study is the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, or the RYC, known as I'tilaf Shabab al-Thawra in Arabic. And I want to clarify from the start that this was just one of many different groups that were active in the revolution, but they stood out as a really important group to focus on for a few reasons. The RYC was made up of the 6 major youth movements most active on the ground leading up to January 25th. They reflected the heterogeneity of Egypt's revolutionaries. So they included men, women, working class and upper class youth, Muslims and Coptic Christians, liberals, leftists, and importantly, Islamists, namely youth of the Muslim Brotherhood. Other groups included the April 6th Youth Movement, Youth for Justice and Freedom Movement, the campaign supporting Baradei, as well as youth factions from other political parties. And what brought together this eclectic group was their joint opposition to the regime and the oppressive status quo, and the strong sense of the shared national pride and a mutual desire for dignity and justice for their people. They played a key role in planning the mass actions on January 25th, including a really critical protest march, without which we might not have had a revolution or even an Arab Spring to speak of today. And I know that's a very bold claim, but I am prepared to defend it shortly. But then after January 25th, they took a lead role in organizing the sit-in in Tahrir Square, and they continued to play an important leadership and organizing role in the revolutionary scene after Mubarak's ouster. The RYC was also the first unified front born of this nationwide revolt. And it was in fact the closest thing the revolution ever had to a vanguard organization, which makes them, in my mind at least, the best candidates for helping us understand leadership processes and activist agency in the revolution. So let's take a closer look now at this question of activist agency during this revolutionary period by exploring it through 3 themes. The first has to do with this question of spontaneity and leaderlessness. The second has to do with the challenges they faced trying to establish revolutionary leadership, right? So how that unfolded during the 18-day uprising and the remaining revolutionary period. The third has to do with how horizontalism or horizontality played out during the movement, right? So how it was an advantage early on, then a liability, and then was even maybe catastrophic for the movement towards the end. These latter 2 themes are going to go hand in hand, so I'll be discussing them together. So I'd like to begin by telling you all the story of January 25th, 2011, this watershed day in Egyptian history, from an angle that I think will be new to a lot of you. So it's the end of the day on January 25th, and there are thousands upon thousands of Egyptians protesting in Tahrir Square, calling for the regime's downfall in an unprecedented uprising that surprised pundits and protesters alike. What made this event such a game changer wasn't just the exceptionally large number of people that came out to protest that day, but the type of people who came out, right? So we saw old and young, rich and notably very poor people. And the fact that they managed to circumvent the police deployed against them and descend upon this strategically located, sprawling open square in the center of Cairo. And we can't emphasize this latter point enough because remember, Egypt was a police state with a terrifying riot police force, specifically designed to prevent the large amassing of people and quash protests, right? And authorities had anticipated these widely announced demonstrations, and they warned that they were going to be heavy-handed in their response. So then the question is, what made all of these people come out despite this threat? And how were they able to overcome the security forces to get to Tahrir? So it turns out that there's this incredible backstory here that Western media mostly missed and is still largely unknown today. And the protagonists of the story are a group of activists who were energized by the unprecedented popular uprising or revolt that had just taken place in Tunisia and unseated the country's 30-year dictator there, Ben Ali. And this was, of course, the first successful uprising in what later became known as the Arab Spring. The activists already had a day of protest planned for what was Police Day, January 25th. This was a national holiday that Mubarak had instituted in 2009 to celebrate the service of the police in maintaining Egypt's security. And the activists had since appropriated that holiday to protest the ruthlessness of the police state. So following Tunisia's success, they now were sort of looking at this day of protest they had planned and thought, okay, what if we can make this day of action even bigger? And so this is an illustration of a really brilliant mobilization strategy that the activists came up with for drawing out a critical mass of protesters onto the streets, starting with Egyptians from the lower and working classes who don't normally protest out of fear of police, but had plenty of reasons to. So the goal of this strategy was actually to help people, the people overcome their fear, right? And it was actually the brainchild of this wonderful activist from the April 6th movement, Mahmoud Sami, and it was two-pronged. The first prong involved a ruse to distract police. So they announced 20 protest locations across Cairo for protesters or demonstrators to gather at, and then they promoted those on social media. And so the idea was to decoy the police to these locations. The second prong involved mobilizing a march from a secret 21st location, and they chose the popular sort of impoverished neighborhood of Bulaq al-Dakour on the periphery of Cairo as the starting point of their march. And so the plan was to try to mobilize a large march that could quickly grow into an unstoppable snowball down Cairo's streets, arriving at Mustafa Mahmoud Square, point B, before the police caught wind. And that was one of the 20 location sites they announced online. So that's what they did. On January 25th, early that morning, Mahmoud and about 250 of his fellow organizers secretly meet in that area to execute their plan, and it works. And in fact, the response is incredible and it far surpasses any of their expectations. And I'd love to just share some of the recollections the activists shared with me of that day. Abdurrahman described their shock and euphoria as they poured over Nahia Bridge and successfully executed the first leg of their strategy. It was as if the people were gushing from beneath the ground. We began crying and hugging each other, and we kept shouting, "Intasarna, we won." What had we won exactly? Who knew? What was coming? Nobody knew. Mustafa also recalled the moment for me with a lot of excitement. Before this, we'd organize a march, and at times we'd be only 20 or 30 people. When there were 500 in our protest, we were over the moon. Now, we couldn't see the beginning of the march from its end. We were so beside ourselves. There was this feeling that if this many people had mobilized, that meant something major had shifted in the country. And then Tariq shared how they reacted when they got to Mustafa Mahmoud Square and then found way more protesters there than they also expected. We were all dazed and like, what are we going to do with all of these people? That's when we started to say, to Tahrir Square. So the activists quickly sketch a route for their march right there on the spot to Tahrir. And while there were other veins of protesters feeding into Tahrir from all over Cairo that day, this is the one that brings in the critical mass that helped facilitate the people's game-changing siege of the square. And so that's why I say that it's very possible without it that we might not have had a revolution or an Arab Spring, since the revolution was the catalyst for the spring. But I share this story to demonstrate why it's reductive to call this eruption spontaneous, right? Rather than spontaneous, I think this is a clear case of painstaking planning by purposeful actors that was met with the wildly unexpected. This speaks to a second problem with this framing, which is that the activists, right, are talking about previous protests that they've organized, right, in these quotes. So they're actually building on a history of action and praxis that they had been developing in the years before. So the problem with calling this uprising spontaneous then is that it's simply ahistorical, right? It actually glosses over the fact that the uprising was made possible by young activists who were part of a growing oppositional movement that they were actively radicalizing through new and youthful forms of political action and imagination. This movement began 10 years earlier in a moment much like today with the Second Palestinian Intifada in the year 2000, which radicalized and inspired many of them to protest for the first time as students in solidarity with their neighbors. They joined the mass street protests that were exploding onto Egypt's streets, and they also participated in and organized protests and other acts of civil disobedience on their campuses, their universities' campuses. So along with the following anti-Iraq war movement, the Intifada serves as their gateway into anti-regime dissent. This movement wave around regional struggles was then followed by 3 subsequent waves, each of which built on the one before it. So there was one around calls for democratic reform with the Kifaya movement, another around an explosive labor struggle, then another around police brutality, and this one was sparked by the brutal police killing of the young man named Khalid Said in the city of Alexandria in the year 2010. So in the first 2 movement waves, which were led by an older generation, right? The 1968, 1973, like the previous political generations, the activists were actually being radicalized and socialized into activism for the first time, these activists that I've studied. But in the second 2 waves, it's this new generation of young activists who are now establishing the movements and leading them. And they're coming up with new protest strategies and tactics. And these included these flash protests in popular quarters, like the one that we saw on January 25th, the aim of which was to bring the ordinary Egyptian masses into the streets and into the struggle, which was something that the older guard had failed to do up to that point. So these young activists were learning from their elders' mistakes, and they were raising the culture of resistance in Egypt to new heights, as they were building this very robust activist network, this loose, horizontal, decentralized movement structure that made space for its participants like Mahmoud to act autonomously and creatively and just step up and be leaders in their own ways. So this horizontalism becomes the defining feature of this larger resistance movement, and I want you guys to remember this because we'll come back to it later. So this brings me to the next point that I want to make, which is that, the reason that these youth were able to even conceive of and successfully execute a strategy like this was because they identified as members of these marginalized classes, and they were embedded among them in the urban periphery where they had already been experimenting with these tactics, right? So Mahmoud Sami, who you guys saw earlier, he, for example, had grown up in one of these popular quarters, an area called Osim. And so he was well-versed in the grievances, spaces, mobility, and vulnerabilities of its residents. And he understood how to negotiate and leverage them in his planning to the advantage of January 25th. And one of those vulnerabilities that the people had was, again, their fear of police, right? Who had dominated these neighborhoods. And the police, in fact, were there to sort of erect barriers between citizens and dissidents like Mahmoud and his peers, who might, inspire them to rise up. So the activists knew this very well. And in the years before January 25th, they were actually testing these boundaries, trying to find blind spots and cracks in the dams, right, of these barriers that the police were kind of erecting. And they were doing this not as outsiders, but as insiders to these areas. So all of this knowledge and experience shapes the activist agency in this January 25th moment. And I emphasize their popular class background and the social capital that it gave them as organizers because the impression the media gave us early on was that the activists who were behind the revolt were these very highly cosmopolitan, English-speaking, tech and internet savvy young people, right? Who came from urban, financially comfortable, who came from urban, financially comfortable, middle and upper class families. And, they might've been current or former students of elite schools like the American University in Cairo. And if you guys remember early on, I showed that image of a Time cover magazine. That's the perfect example of this kind of framing, right? And I know several of the activists were in that picture, and I can tell you they weren't from this background, right? So this portrayal was highly inaccurate. Most of the activists behind the revolt did not speak English. They did not go to elite universities, nor were they digital activists operating from behind a screen. They were popular class youth, organizing and putting their bodies on the line in these urban areas where they came from. So this is not primarily a social media story, right? Social media is just one part of the story of how activists were exercising their agency and using the tools available to them to mobilize the masses. And I think all of this also makes me question this leaderless term and wonder whether terms that have been thrown around like leaderful might be a better description for this movement, because there were a lot of people taking initiative and acting on their own way, and we can discuss that more later. Or is she gonna get it?
Trying to figure it out.
All right, cool. We'll just keep going. But now I want to look at, what happens with the activists during the 18 days, beginning with a return to that quote by Tarek that I showed earlier, in which he says, "What are we going to do with all of these people?" And in Arabic, that's "Hanaman ibn Nasti kullaha," right? One of the reasons I really love this quote is because it captures the shock of the activists and the dilemma that they found themselves in on January 25th. With the success of their mass action, something unexpected was happening to them, right? Which is that their status was suddenly changing from activists to revolutionaries, and they're trying to wrap their heads around what that means. None of them had imagined the possibility of revolution, right? Everybody dreams of revolution, but it's a very different thing to imagine it. So they were unprepared when the opportunity suddenly availed itself. The eradication of political space under Mubarak meant that they didn't have an opportunity to engage in real political life and develop political acumen beyond protests. So now they're trying to figure out what role they should play, if any, as leaders in this nascent revolutionary struggle. And this brings me to the next reason why I love this quote. It actually reminds me of another question a famous revolutionary once asked. And I want to see if anybody wants to take a guess as to what that question might be. Any guesses?
What is to be done?
What is to be done, of course. Yes, What is to be done, which is the title of Lenin's famous book on revolutionary organizing and strategizing. So to me, that question almost sounds like a spin-off of this, of Lenin's famous question. And it actually turns out that the activists were engaging, that the questions that the activists were engaging with in this moment were really no different from those that occupied revolutionary strategists from the Marxist tradition, like Lenin and Luxemburg, right? Rosa Luxemburg, Vladimir Lenin. It's the question of, are the masses capable of carrying out a revolution spontaneous on their own? Or do they need leaders to organize them? Lenin, of course, was of the opinion that the masses couldn't do it on their own, that they needed guidance and leadership from professional revolutionaries who were tied to a highly disciplined, centralized, hierarchical vanguard organization. But Luxemburg, on the other hand, she saw this as elitist and argued that the masses were capable of becoming their own leaders naturally through their engagement with the struggle. So what I'm interested in is how these ideas, which generally map out onto the concepts of, horizontality or horizontalism and verticalism in movements, how they played out amongst the activists and shaped their agency during the uprising. So eventually, as events escalate, the network of youth activists and movements that had together sparked January 25th come to the realization that they do, in fact, need to provide some kind of leadership to the square, or else this whole thing was going to fall apart and they were going to miss the opportunity and the moment. So about 10 days into the uprising, they announced their consolidation as the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. And I'll talk now about some of the dynamics and developments that led to their formation and then the challenges that they faced afterwards. So up until the point they announced themselves as the coalition, the activists were reluctant to step to the forefront of the movement in any way as leaders. And instead, they were leading from behind the scenes and engaging in what I like to call performing leaderlessness. And there were several reasons for this. The first had to do with the horizontal, decentralized nature of their movement, which had carried over from the previous period. So while the activist status changed from activists to revolutionaries, what didn't change, what remained constant was the movement structure, right? And so now we start to see a tension between the two. So just as this horizontality had for years empowered them to take initiative and act autonomously and creatively, it was now empowering the thousands of Egyptians who were joining the movement to do the same. And so in doing so, it started to now constrain the activists and how they could show up as leaders. So the more the movement grew, the less the young revolutionaries felt it was their place to proclaim to be its leaders. This was now a mass people's movement. And in fact, they couldn't really claim leadership even if they wanted to, because the movement itself fetishized its popular leaderless nature, right? It would have just torn them down. The movement's leaderlessness is what made it legitimate in everyone's eyes, right? So that was the image that the activists and the protesters kept promoting. Plus, if they were to declare themselves as leaders, that would have made them instant regime targets, right? So there was that threat that they had to navigate that risk. And then lastly, claiming this kind of leadership was a really big move that nobody was prepared to make, because again, what does it mean to lead a revolution in this moment in Egypt, right? What kind of responsibility are we committing to shouldering? So they're wrestling with this ambiguity. So this was the position of the activists until after an event called the Battle of the Camel, which was this very violent episode in which the regime sent thugs to attack protesters in the square. Thereafter, some members of the opposition formed themselves into a group called the Council of Wise Men, which was really triggering for the young people and the women in the square. And then they start to enter into negotiations with government officials about how to bring an end to the impasse. And so that's when these activists realized that there had to be some kind of an official group that represented the radical position of the square to protect it from being, undermined, demobilized, and sold out. So they quickly announced the RYC on February 6th, and the first proclamation was, لا تفاوض قبل الرحيل. There's no negotiations between the departure of Mubarak, right? And they said that they would continue to occupy the square until their demands were met. So the RYC in that moment becomes the closest thing we see to a vanguard in the square. But then after the RYC's formation, it became clear to RYC members and other groups that as an organizational front for the revolution, the RYC was insufficient. There remained this need to institute a wider consensus among the many opposition forces present on how to move forward through the establishment of a more representative body. So these were not honest, made possible by activists who were embedded in the position. This is the Time magazine. And then back to not a social media story, leaderless or leaderful. Okay. This was the question. And then this is Lennon's question.
Let's put the camera on.
Sure. Am I not on camera?
Yeah.
video,
Okay.
so now they can see you.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
perfect.
These are our friends, Lenin and Luxembourg, sorry. Wait, I don't know why it's not like, okay. All right, here you go. And then this one. This is the moment when they announced themselves in the square and they raised their protesters. This was them in their tents. I think that was before. So this is where we're at. We're talking about the pressure to perform leaderlessness, right? Leaderlessness becomes a problem. So I think that I'm on bullet 3, yeah. So as I mentioned, so after the RYC came into this formation, it became clear to the members of the group, as well as other groups, that as an organizational front for the revolution, the RYC was still insufficient, right? There was still this need to institute a wider consensus among the many, many oppositional forces that were present on, how do we move forward together through the establishment of some kind of a body that's more representative of all of us in the square. And this became especially urgent as they were trying to escalate and get Mubarak to step down, and they still didn't have a body that could claim power on behalf of the movement or the revolution. So one of the constraints that the RYC ran up against as they were trying to figure out what to do is the fact that they lacked political experience and senior rank, right? So they attempted to overcome this by engaging with the old guard and bringing them into a larger revolutionary coalition. But then there were these intergenerational tensions that surfaced. The old guard sort of felt, upstaged by the youth in this moment, like they were stealing the limelight, right? And there was a lot of friction that resulted from that really hindered their efforts to produce leadership and build revolutionary organizations and vehicles. The next challenge, or the other challenge the revolutionaries faced, had to do with their commitment to bottom-up consensus building processes, what we can call participatory democratic practice, as their method for collective decision-making. This horizontality, this democratic practice, proved to be extremely time-consuming, and it didn't match the urgency of the revolutionary moment, especially as the elite were also making moves to try to figure out how to contain the movement, right? So the revolutionaries needed to act quickly, but this process slowed them down and ultimately undermined them. So in the end, the revolutionaries were outmaneuvered by SCAF, who took power before they could seize it and before they could really coordinate and seize it themselves, in the form of, a popularly backed civilian-led transitional government or some other kind of formation. These dynamics then carry over to the transitional period and become even more complicated. So with Mubarak now removed and out of the picture, these young revolutionaries lose the common cause that unified them. They also now have to deal with SCAF being in power and the Muslim Brotherhood basically throwing them under the bus. So they're essentially out-organized, right? They were put in this position where they had to figure out how to build the plane as they were flying it, right? How to execute a revolution without really not having a manual to do that. And they could just never get ahead of their opponents. So there were these moments in the revolution that felt like history was repeating itself and giving revolutionaries a second chance to make up for their mistakes in the 18-day uprising. And one of those moments was the so-called Second Revolution, which coincided with the Mohammed Mahmoud street clashes in November of 2011. But what happens is that the activists fall into the same dynamics that they did back then in early January. They essentially struggle to escape them. These now reveal themselves to be like structural problems in the movement. And I got to see a lot of this for myself because I was actually there conducting my fieldwork at the time. So this pressure to perform leaderlessness comes up again. And I think the perfect example of that is this sign that appeared in Tahrir. It articulates rules that the protesters must follow in the square, but it's signed by the Egyptian people, when in fact, clearly there's a group behind it that's unwilling to put their name on it. The second was this leadership archipelago phenomena, where the movement felt like a bunch of islands with different leadership groups emerging on them. These groups were often unaware of each other's activities, and they even acted at cross purposes as they were each trying to figure out how to capitalize on the political opening and seize power for the movement. There were also a lot of endless meetings, and I got this from the title of a book called Freedom is an Endless Meeting, which I think is a great title. But these meetings, they took forever because the aim, again, was to reach consensus about the way forward. But again, this method simply just didn't, match the urgency of the moment. And then again, we saw the limits of youthfulness. So the activists wanted to form some kind of a civilian authority to speak on behalf of the revolution in the square and take back ownership of the transition period from the military. But they couldn't say, we're the transitional government, because no one would take them seriously. So they tried to get some senior opposition figures on board with this plan that they had. Several were initially interested in their proposed initiative, but then they later backed out, and then the whole thing fell apart. So the culmination of all of this was that another opportunity to seize power for the movement was lost. So the activists really needed to pivot into more structure and vision in order to cohere and sustain their movement, but they couldn't due to these various constraints. And this just became more and more difficult as time passed and the movement became more decentralized and more fractured. So as one of the main forces of the revolution, the RYC is embedded in these horizontal dynamics, and they're contributing to them and reflecting them even as they're trying to navigate them and overcome them. Eventually, they disbanded right after the election of Morsi in 2012 of June. I think it was June or July, yes. They said that with the end of the transition period, it was time to think about new organizational forms that could serve them in the next stage of the struggle. But the truth is that they also disbanded because by this point, they had been struggling a lot as a coalition due to internal and external challenges caused by these dynamics, right? And one of those challenges related to their ideological differences, which were now beginning to create a wedge between them, just as it had historically done for the opposition in Egypt. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the counter-revolution and how the movement's horizontality played into that, looking specifically at the Tamarrud movement, which erupted against Morsi in June of 2013. This is basically a decentralized petition campaign demanding Morsi to resign, and it's embraced widely and quickly by Egyptians across the country. What's notable about this movement is that it sort of erupted in this leadership vacuum, right? There's no RYC now or any other salient group. And it became very clear that there were unsavory actors behind it. So we had figures from the old regime, the military, the police. And so this is when we start to see the most serious drawbacks of this horizontality, which is that if a revolutionary movement is too horizontal and too open, then anyone can claim to speak for it. So that's what happened. The deep state appropriated the language and the tactics of the revolution to carry out the counter-revolution. So what Tamarrud shows us then is that this agendaless, leaderless, structureless, diffuse movement model is very vulnerable to being co-opted. Okay, so where does this all leave us today? I want to share this hopeful reflection from activist Ala Shahba. She says, I think the revolution is still achievable. I don't think of it as a step back. I think of it as a process that we've always realized it will be ups and downs. I think we had to go through this. Let's see. We're hoping it doesn't bring us down. I really love this quote by Ala because I think it speaks very well to this idea of revolution as an iterative process, right? As a learning experience. It's a reminder to sort of avoid fixating on the outcome and calling this a failed project and instead stay focused on the potential. And it also reminds me of another quote from our friend Lenin, especially this part about, I think we had to go through this. He says, there are moments in history when a desperate struggle of the masses, even for a hopeless cause, is essential for the further schooling of these masses and their struggle training the next generation. So jumping off of Lenin's remarks, I like to think of the Egyptian Revolution as a masterclass in the challenges of revolutionary leadership and organizing in the 21st century. My hope is that my work will help us better understand the complexity of this challenge and stretch the ideas of classical Marxist theorists like Lenin as we learn from this experience and theorize new ways forward. So in that spirit, I'd like to share some of the questions I'm grappling with for you all to consider. And I have a lot, but these are some of the more general ones. Was the revolution permanently defeated? Or in general, when we think about defeats in movements, do we think of them as defeats that are permanent, or as simply a stage in a longer process of revolutionary action and transformation? How might this experiment lead us to more effective modes of revolutionary leadership and organization? Are the choices between verticalism and horizontalism, or is the lesson that contemporary revolutionary movements, or we could say movements for social transformation, have to be imagined, organized, and led completely differently? And I think that these are really important questions for us to consider and think about in light of the wave of mass movements that have erupted around the globe since 2011, right? Many of these movements were in fact unleashed by the Egyptian revolution, such as Occupy, which is what makes the Egyptian revolution so globally and historically significant. A lot of these movements have in some way shared characteristics with the Egyptian revolution, one of those things being its loose horizontal organizational form. And just as we saw that become a liability for the Egyptian revolution, the same thing has happened with a lot of these movements. So this brings me back full circle to the moment we're in today with Gaza. As horrific as this tragedy has been, it's also given us, I think, an unprecedented, hopeful opening. It's ignited mass protests across the Middle East, evoking the memory of the Arab Spring. In Cairo, we saw Egyptians bravely take to the streets despite the high security risk. They marched to Tahrir Square for the first time since 2013, and they chanted "Bread, Freedom, and an Arab Palestine," a spin-off of their famous slogan from 2011, "Bread, Freedom, and Social Justice." So this is a clear reflection of the central place Palestine still holds in their revolutionary imagination. And the solidarity protests globally have been some of the largest and most sustained we've seen yet. And indeed, the most inspiring expression of the solidarity has been the student uprising that we saw in 2024, led by youth in the belly of US empire, in fact, New York, led by youth in New York, and there you are being represented in the corner. And to me, this was just a remarkable twist that mirrored the radicalizing effect the second Palestinian Intifada had on Egypt's would-be youth revolutionaries. So think about where these students could end up in 10 years, right? Gaza has been radicalizing people across the global south and north as it's been exposing the duplicity of the West and the hollowness of their liberal rules-based order. And I think we've reached a tipping point or a turning point. More and more people are seeing their stake in Palestine's liberation and the role they must play in it if they also want to get free. So then the question now is, what is the way forward through this crisis beyond protest? If the aspiration is a free Palestine, then what does a new world in which that aspiration is realized actually look like? And how do we get there, right? What's the pathway? What is the vehicle for sustaining global popular commitment for the long haul? How do we build an expansive, enduring international movement that can take on global capital and empire, topple empire, right? These are huge questions, but we have to consider them. And just to conclude on a personal note, I like to share that the Egyptian revolution meant a lot to me personally. It was a transformational experience for me to be a part of it. And I learned a lot about myself and my own agency through my engagement with the activists and their struggle. There's this expression that Egyptian revolutionaries used to say a lot in those years of upheaval, and it was "Athawra mustamirra," the revolution continues. Sadly, nobody says it anymore, right? Which is disheartening. But I'm hopeful that by learning from their experience, we can somehow collectively breathe new life into it again and make it meaningful again soon. Thank you so much for your attention.